Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this event today. I am Alexandra Florescu from Nemira Publishing House, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Maaza Mengiste, the author of the stunning novel, The Shadow King. This is the book. It's been nominated at the prestigious Booker Prize Award, and it has been recently translated into Romanian at Nemira Publishing House. Hello, Maaza.
Hello, it's nice to meet you. I see you again, Alexandra.
So because maybe some people who will be following this interview will not have read the book by this time, this is a story about courageous women in Ethiopia taking up arms and becoming soldiers against the Italian invasion under Benito Mussolini in 1935. So it's obviously a story about courage, about honor, but also about the shadows that the war casts on everyday life of normal people. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, how you got to this story and why you decided to write it.
I had heard this story of the war since I was a child, but I only heard about it from the male perspective. There were members of my family who fought in the war. And so I heard about my great uncles. I heard about different men in my family that fought. And I decided to write the book inspired by those stories. But in the middle of research, I started discovering that women also fought in the war, and that changed my book completely. And that I found that much more inspiring and much more interesting to think about war from a woman's perspective.
Because it's obviously a real historical event, and these are real facts, but they are things that are not in the, let's say, mainstream historical narrative. And you say in an interview very beautifully that the language of war is always masculine, and we automatically position history in terms of what men did. So I wanted to ask you how you thought about your creative process and the narrative structure of the novel so as to give women the voice instead.
I wanted to think about the way that a book might reflect the omissions in history. I wanted to tell this book with many different voices, because I wanted those voices to be able to fill in other details of this history that one voice would not know completely. If history is a series of narratives told by human beings that are then, those narratives are recorded, we need to think of history less as a linear and single voice, and begin to imagine that history is like an orchestra. It's a choir. It's many different voices from different angles, telling something that is maybe even the details might compete and conflict, but this is what happened according to my experience, and we need to have as many voices saying that. And I wondered what a book would look like, or what structure, that form would be, if I imagined history as not a linear thing, but almost like a prism. And so that helped to shape the book, different voices, the chorus, the photographs, the different perspectives. I moved from Hirut to Ettore, sometimes to Carlo Fucelli. So each of them had their own kind of war, and I wanted to reflect that.
So it's pretty obvious that you had to do a pretty hard work of research for this book. Can you tell us about that a bit?
It took a lot longer than I expected in the beginning. The research was intense. I lived in Rome for almost a year in order to do this research. And I was working in the archives, looking at materials that had been saved by the fascists. And maybe if I had stayed there, the research would not have taken so long. But I realized very quickly that this information had been censored. This was a curated history. It was a curated memory of this particular war. I left the archives and started speaking to the descendants of people who fought. And that's really where the research came alive. I started looking for photographs, letters, journals, anything that soldiers might have kept that would not have been censored. And it took some time, and that's where the book came alive.
So you went from the archives to the oral history, let's say.
Absolutely, yes.
But were those questions well received?
That is an excellent question. It made people uncomfortable sometimes. I had friends tell me when I asked them to go ask their family if they had a relative who fought in the war. Some of them didn't know. They had no idea until they asked that there was somebody, an uncle, a grandfather that actually was in Ethiopia. I had a friend tell me, Ethiopia in my family is like a wall. We do not speak of it. When her grandfather was in the war, she said, we never could say the name Ethiopia in my family. So it was uncomfortable. If I was in shops, in antique shops, looking for photographs, it would make the vendor, the shop owner, very uncomfortable sometimes for me to ask questions. If I was in an archive in Rome asking for materials in the library, people, it would make them uncomfortable, and they would either say we have nothing or just spend their entire day helping me because they felt so guilty. So I would have these different reactions to that.
But what about the other side? I don't know, relatives, family, friends, or distant friends from Ethiopia. Did you get anything there from their memories?
I would get information from small details, but most of the history that was remembered in Ethiopia was also a kind of curated memory. People remembered stories of victory in battles. There were stories that would get passed down of brave acts, stories of solidarity. But if I started asking about collaborators with Italy, or what about, we did not win every single battle, what were some of the humiliations of war? If I asked questions about what happened to women, what happened to the women in my family during this time, that would be an uncomfortable thing too. And I often did not get all of that information.
Quite the puzzle you had there from all points of view.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I realized I had to do was imagine other conflicts in other countries. And so I was looking at the women's experiences in the Spanish Civil War, in different anti-colonial movements, in resistance movements. I was looking for those stories because the experiences of women would probably be similar in Ethiopia. And that's where a lot of the research also happened.
You mentioned several times photography, and it's beautiful that there are some photographs there are photographs in the book that actually forward the story or that put light on some part of the story. And since we live in such a visual, imagistic world, what is your take on what photography tells us actually about the future, about the past, sorry? Especially war photography.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how much. What it does, I'll tell you, what it does tell us is it tells us the story of power. It tells us the story not of people who were subjected to colonialism, for example, or people subjected to fascism or authoritarian regimes. It tells us less about them, even if they were the ones in front of the camera being photographed. Every single one of those images that were made in the service of power, in the service of whoever's holding the camera, and where that person comes from and who he or she might represent. And so when I look at these images now of conflict, of war, particularly of the past and colonial era photographs, I imagine them as self-portraits of the photographer, self-portraits of that country. And that's the first step. And then I try to think about what it is actually revealing to me about that person, the photographer, or the country that they represent.
Because everything was staged. And in this case, the gaze, absolutely, let's say, matters more than the object.
Absolutely.
How was it when you heard about the Booker Prize? I'm sure everybody wants to hear that story. When you heard about the nomination,
I screamed when my editor called me, and she said, "Are you sitting down?" So I sat down, and she told me, and I screamed, and I think both of us were just yelling into the phone, oh my God, I can't believe it. And then when she hung up, I was still sitting down, and I just got very quiet, and I couldn't speak for a long time. And I just sat there. So I went from complete surprise to complete shock. And it was a wonderful experience. It has been wonderful.
Well, it's absolutely well-deserved. And I wanted my last question to be a pretty important one, I think. If you think or feel or hope that your book is a sort of brick or a step in the decolonizing of history.
I hope that it is another step. I think that for me with this book would be what I call success. But my book comes in a long line of other women and other people who have been writing about this history, but writing to decolonize their own nation's memories and conversations. And this is happening around the world, and it's happening by women who are writing these stories. I just think, Svetlana Alexievich for me is somebody whose work I greatly admire. Dasha Drindic who passed away not long ago from Croatia has been doing this work. In Italy, there's Ijaba Shaggo, Gabriella Germandi. I'm just following a path that they have opened, and I hope that I am pushing it forward for somebody else to move ahead also.
So it's beautiful to be a part of this puzzle of narratives, of alternate narratives of history that can comprise actually a better view on not such a distant period in time, but that we all know through as you said, very curated perspectives.
Yes.
So I can only encourage everybody to discover not only a beautiful story, but also an important book, because it's about us and it's about the history of the world that we don't really see at all, maybe in general historical books. Maaza Mengiste, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you, Alexandra. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.